Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Rafael Amaya Extended Fermentation Wash Process Colombia from Red Bank Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Red Bank, based out of Lake District, England, and this coffee right here was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video as part of a viewer subscriber recommendation video where it did finish 4th place out of 4 coffees on that day. Now, we did note in that video that it was extremely difficult to rank all 4 of those coffees, and truth be told, this coffee could have finished anywhere between 4th place and 1st place. So we were just kind of curious to see how all 4 of those coffees might compare by the end of drinking all of them. Now, let's discuss a little bit about Red Bank. So this coffee roaster was suggested to us by Tim Tam Jimmy. So shout out to and thank you to Tim Tam Jimmy for the suggestion. And their coffee roaster we had zero familiarity with going into that video. We do have a lot of familiarity with English coffee roasters as a whole, as for so many years people had bringing us back coffees from London, most notably places like Square Mile and Ozone. And even before COVID started, we got an opportunity to spend 3 weeks in London, basically on a 3-week-long coffee crawl, trying all the coffee roasters and coffee shops we could. So it's safe to say we have at least a fair bit of familiarity with English coffee roasters. Even then, we hadn't heard of them, and pulling up information and research about this coffee roaster, there isn't even a whole lot about them online either. Because what we did find was that they were founded in 2015, and aside from that, it was mostly just reactions to their coffee, and they were pretty positive as a whole. So it's safe to say that a lot of people do enjoy this coffee roaster, and if a place like Dayglow, which is where we purchase this coffee from, is using them pretty regularly, then they have received at least a fair bit of acclaim themselves for being a pretty good English coffee roaster. This right here is day 42 of this coffee. We did want to note that it's actually a lot more difficult to get English coffee in the United States than it is so many other European countries. I don't necessarily even know why that is. It's not even that easy to find places like Square Mile in the United States. So take that for whatever it's worth. But recipe we settled on for this coffee is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio brewed at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll get into the reason for that a little bit later. But this, of course we brewed through the Chemex, but this is kind of interesting. This is probably one of the lightest extended fermentation, we'll call it, processed coffees and English coffees we've had. So we're just gonna call this a light European for the roast profile. And let's start discussing the coffee itself. So day 29, which was the blind taste test rankings video day, and we did note that it tasted like 2 coffees specifically, the Blue Raspberry from Luna and the Asias Fernandez from Blind Tiger, which were both anaerobic processed coffees, one anaerobic washed, one anaerobic natural, but it did have a slight bit of that anaerobic component to it, which we often describe as a fermented alcohol sort of taste to it. But even then, it was super tart, super unique, and different enough that we did enjoy it on that day. So we were more than happy to actually kind of place that coffee pretty high, especially for it being a extended fermentation, as they call it. We'll probably just call it anaerobic for purposes of this video. Day 30, we went back, and the coffee had, again, this really tart and vibrant component right off the start, and that's what we have to emphasize, is at these warmer temperatures, because we started it off pretty hot. It is very vibrant, and it is very tart, and it never dissipated much either, and you were experiencing a lot of that fermented alcoholic kind of component finished to the coffee. And what we most notably described on this day was the slight pear juice. There were a slight bit of other things, maybe some slight stone fruits, and of course the ever prominent and present tart component in this cup of coffee. Day 31, not much had changed, and given that we had gotten this coffee so late, day 29 is when we started it, we knew that this coffee wasn't necessarily going to change by the time we were drinking it unless we adjusted our ratios or our recipes. So that's what we started doing post day 31. And day 33, we ran it through the automatic coffee maker just to see what sort of changes we might get. And it was a pretty heavy cup with, again, this strong citrus and a bit of that fermented component, but our main goal and objective of this coffee was to see if we might be able to reduce that fermented alcoholic component as much as possible in this cup of coffee, because buried underneath that was a really beautiful wild flavor that we really wanted to maybe emphasize that a little bit more than the alcoholic component of the coffee. Day 35, that's when we did lower the temperature at 200 degrees Fahrenheit when we were brewing it through the Chemex, and it was a far more drinkable cup of coffee. And the best thing I have to say about this coffee is how drinkable this coffee is. I could honestly sit here and drink this coffee in just one sitting, just like chug the entire coffee, as opposed to most coffees, which I usually prefer sipping. But it's got this really pleasant sort of tart apple juice flavor to it that it makes it a super drinkable cup of coffee. One of the most drinkable cups of coffee I've reviewed on this channel altogether. Pretty tart, lost a lot of that fermentation, best day of the coffee by that point, and that's what we've settled on. Really was enjoying the way that that fermented component had dialed down, and it brought out the more pleasant components of this cup of coffee. And day 37 went back to the exact same thing and noted again, extremely drinkable cup of coffee, very tolerable for the anaerobic component in this cup of coffee, and it essentially was a really pleasant tart juice. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we'll start off by saying not necessarily overly happy with the way that this tasting wheel looks, but it's because it was a pretty tricky and complicated coffee that's changed so much based off, very simple adjustments to the coffee. But things that will jump out, of course, is the finish and the citrus fruit, and that shouldn't be surprising, as we've noted in so many other videos that these anaerobic coffees tend to last a very, very long time. Citrus fruit level 5, and the citrus fruit, of course, most closely will be aligned with that green apple sort of tart component to it, as that's most closely in line with the citrus fruit. We did note that there were some pretty heavy stone fruits from time to time, so the stone fruit, of course, being at level 4, darker stone fruits as you would imagine. But other things worth noting, acidity at level 4, definitely, and the sweetness at level 3, and I couldn't necessarily decide on where I wanted to put that. I probably should have just readjusted that to level 4, but it is a pretty sweet cup of coffee from certain times. The reason I settled on it being a level 3 was because the tart was just stronger than the sweet, so that's why the sweetness was just kind of left there at that level 3. Let's see here, other things worth noting, you at least have a level 2 for pretty much everything in this tasting wheel. The caramel, there's a really nice pleasant sweetness that I will mostly align with caramel sweetness in this cup of coffee too, so even though it's not necessarily overly caramel specific, it's this really nice sweet component that comes from this cup of coffee, and that's why I placed the caramel a little bit higher than a lot of the other things in this tasting wheel. But again, we noted going into this that we weren't overly happy with the way that this tasting wheel looks, but this is the best I could probably do with this coffee, as it was a kind of just more tricky coffee than normal. All right, overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, really positive. Again, this was a really positive cup of coffee, and it wasn't necessarily something I was expecting, as given that first impression, it was good. But I kind of said to myself, I've had so many of these coffees that start out good, and then by the end, I'm like, I can't keep drinking this coffee. This was the exception to that rule, as it had such a unique and different flavor from a lot of those other anaerobic coffees that even by the end, I wasn't sick of drinking this coffee. And that is huge credits to Red Bank, as they took something that is not my sort of coffee, not my flavor profile, and made it something that was very enjoyable. So I have a huge amount of praise and acclaim for this coffee roasters. I think they did an amazing job. I'm kind of curious to see how a coffee that is a lot more my flavor profile, something a little bit more tame relative to these anaerobics, might turn out. As if they did a really good job of something that I don't necessarily typically tend to love for most coffee roasters, then that's a pretty strong indictment that they would do something really positive with something that is a lot more my flavor profile. So kudos to Red Bank for this coffee. Even though it finished 4th on that today, it definitely wasn't my least favorite coffee from that table by the end. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, it's a must that you have to enjoy your anaerobic coffees, because at this point, I feel like anybody that is in strong opposition to these anaerobic coffees, it's always going to be kind of pulling teeth and a little bit more difficult to enjoy something like this that does have this fermented component to it. Even dialing it down, it's still there, it's still pleasant, and it's present, and it still leaves a very lasting finish. So just keep that in mind, and if you do enjoy that, then keep in mind a very tart sort of taste to this coffee, as that was by far the most dominant thing, and the thing that you'll pick out and will be the most lasting and notable thing that you get from this cup of coffee from start to finish. But I think I'm going to leave this review at that, as I think this is the best I could do with a coffee that was a little bit more out there than normal. If you have by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee or Red Bank, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it or them as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like and subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Rafael Amaya Extended Fermentation Wash Process Colombia from Red Bank Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.